Good afternoon or good morning to everyone joining us today. I'm Anissa, the head of media programs here at Spark News. Some of you might already know us or even be collaborating with us, but just in case, we are a mission-driven company which partners with media from around the world to bring to light constructive narrative to accelerate the ecological and social transition towards a more sustainable and inclusive world. And this year, in the light of the Generation Equality Forum, which took place a few months ago, we brought together a coalition of 15 leading media from around the world, from Madame Figaro in France, from the Mail and Guardian in South Africa, Folha de Sao Paulo in Brazil, and the list goes on. They published in both print and online articles featuring some of the most successful initiatives and changemakers pushing forward gender equality and thus society at large. And it's not because that the GF is now behind us that our and that your commitment for gender equality has to stop. And on the contrary, it's now more than ever essential for journalists from around the world to continue covering gender equality challenges with a constructive lens. And on that topic, I think that we can all agree here today that the pandemic has certainly put the spotlight on the value of care work, both paid and unpaid. From childcare, education, health, social care workers, those employed in institutional long-term care settings, informal or unpaid, they are essential to our well-functioning economies. Yet care work is largely performed by women and too often undervalued, underpaid, and lacking investments. And the unequal distribution of unpaid care and housework perpetuates gender equality and economic opportunities. And this is why today we wanted to ask our incredible panelists some burning questions. How can our societies support sustainable caregiving systems? How can policy contribute to building a care economy that dignifies the work of caregivers, all the while expanding access to quality and affordable care? And last but not least, how can we change the narrative to make care work not only visible, but really valued in our societies? And to help us answer those questions, it's my pleasure to introduce you with our moderator of the day, Alisha Gupta, gender reporter at the New York Times. Alisha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Anissa. Thanks for that introduction. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone joining me today. As Anissa said, in the last year and a half, we saw that the economy simply could not function without the invisible, unpaid care work, which is disproportionately shouldered by women around the world. There isn't a single country in the world where more men than women do this unpaid care work. And the question today is what would happen if we did formally think of that unpaid labor as a productive part of the economy? Some estimates from before the pandemic suggest that labor could be worth $10 trillion, and that might be a conservative estimate. A more recent estimate by McKinsey suggests that helping women, in part by lowering that care burden, could add $13 trillion to the post-pandemic global economy by 2030. So to dig into this a little more, I'm joined by three ladies who are all experts in the field of care work. Ai-jen Poo, Executive Director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Raquel Lagunas, Global Director of Gender Equality at the UNDP, and Alessandra Mezzadri, Senior Lecturer of Development Studies and Feminist Political Economy at SOAS University. Thank you, ladies, for being here with me. Let's just wait until you're all here, popped into the window. Are we all here? Great. Ai-jen, I actually want to start with you. And I want to start quite broadly. This idea of the care economy, I think it's activists and researchers and economists have been looking into this for a long time, but it's now entering the mainstream. So I just want you to give us sort of a broad definition of what is a care economy? What does that actually mean?
The way I think about the care economy, and it's wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much for moderating us, Alisha. I'm so glad we're having this conversation. It's so timely and so important given the economic challenges and opportunities ahead of us. So the way I think about the care economy is the part of our economy that is really the foundation of everything else. It's the part that allows us and supports us to take care of our families across generations, assuming that that is fundamental to our ability to work and participate in all other aspects of society and the economy. It's childcare, it's the paid family and medical leave, it's the long-term care for the elderly and for people with disabilities and for the ill.
Yeah.
It happens at home, and it also happens in congregate settings and in institutional settings, but it is a massive foundational part of our entire economy that makes everything else possible.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think the really fascinating part of your work is that you've been doing this for a long time, and you're not just talking about how essential the care economy is, but so many times, and I know you've mentioned this in conversations that we've had, you've tried to explain how care work is the future of work. So can we get into that a little bit? Tell me more about that.
Absolutely. In so many of our societies, we have a growing aging population, for example, where, the demographics are changing so that we have this huge population of the baby boom generation aging into retirement, turning 65 at a rate of 10,000 people per day in the United States, turning 65.
Mm-hmm.
And then because of advances in healthcare and technology and changes in our culture, people are living longer than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
So we've essentially added an entire generation onto our lifespan, but not adapted any of our policies, our social programs, or even our culture to really support a dignified quality of life for that additional lifespan.
Right.
So we need more care on the older end of our generation, our generational spectrum, than ever before. At the same time, we also have millennials giving birth in the United States, at least, to 4 million babies per year. So we need childcare.
Yeah.
And we have this new phenomenon of the sandwich generation that is pressured between the demands of childcare and elder care. So we need a lot of care.
Mm-hmm.
And we live in a time when most working age adults have to work outside of the home in order to make ends meet. So we have less actual formal care in the framework that we had it before, where it was a lot of women staying at home, taking care of family members. So the care workforce, therefore, is growing at an incredibly rapid pace because there's a huge demand for professional care work.
Mm-hmm.
But this work has been undervalued and unsustainable for generations.
Right.
So we're in this situation where we know we need more care, and more of us are providing it. And these are jobs that can't be outsourced and won't be automated, at least anytime soon. There's some debates about that. So for sure, we know that care jobs are going to be a huge share of the jobs of the future. No matter what questions you have about the future of work, we know that if we invested in them becoming good jobs, we would see a huge share of the jobs of the future becoming good jobs.
Right. Alessandra, I want to bring you in here. You've been studying the relationship between work and life globally, in the global North and the global South. Could you give us an overview of the differences and similarities between these two regions?
Well, there is a significant difference in the way in which labor and life actually organize, and we have seen this with the disruption brought by COVID. So there has been change across the planet, I have to say, but with different qualitative changes. So for instance, if you look at ILO estimates, by the time the pandemic started, we had around, say, 30 to 35% of jobs in North America and Western Europe that could be insourced in the home. So that could be performed as new home working jobs, professional service jobs, service of middle to high end, and customer services, of course, and managerial position. Now, we have a lot of jobs in the so-called core economies, while in the global south, this was very different. And in fact, the same data suggests that for emerging economies, these insourcings were only possible for 15 to 18% of jobs. And for sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, we're looking at the possibility only of 8%, and 6% and 8%. Now, in the global south, you already had a huge percentage of home workers, but this will be very different home workers. And these are highly informalized, and actually they resented the lockdown measures because they actually saw their links with final markets broken. So in effect, then the crisis involved different effects for different people. We heard about disruption for food systems in informal food markets in Uganda or Kenya, for instance, as a case in point. Now, the similarities, however, to reconnect with what Heijan was saying, relates to the organization, well, the role that care, and particularly unpaid care, played within this overall picture. So in the global north, we know that women took the hit because they lost jobs more than proportionally, and or they decided to leave their jobs because now the reproductive burden actually ballooned. And we see that, for instance, in the UK, this is becoming a longer term effect for women. For instance, before the summer, we know that 70% of women's furlough applications were rejected. Now, in the global south, you have this on steroids because you had not just that women actually had to internalize losses, say, from the closure of schools, or they face loss in earnings, but in countries, for instance, like India, they saw a massive exodus of migrants going back to villages. They also have to accommodate and care for returning migrants that at this point earn nothing at all. And there is evidence of a great work done by Women's Collective in actually supporting life during the pandemic through the setup of community kitchen in Kerala, or through, in Argentina, the work of popular economies. So I would say on the balance, you see a lot of differences. And if something that brings it all together, of course, is the reliance on care work.
And the reliance on women doing that.
Yeah, of course.
So Alessandra, you mentioned insourcing and, the percentages around the world of people being able to do that. Can you explain that a little bit more for in layman's terms, what that means?
Well, basically, in Europe and the United States, you have a lot of work that we perform outside that we moved into the home. My job is a case in point. It's hardly a precarious job. I'm an academic, and I've been comfortably sitting at home whilst I lecture in my university. In fact, I've been able to lecture in a lot of places, I have to say, in this last year and a half because of the new online systems. So this type of jobs, which are professionals' jobs, were easy to insource. While paradoxically, in the places where home working is already a characteristic of how economies work, these particular jobs, however, are connected to, say, global commodity chains, which instead were hugely disrupted. So ultimately, despite we already found home working in these places, people couldn't benefit from that. So livelihoods were severely disrupted.
I see. Okay. Raquel, I want to bring you in. I think you had a little bit of a connection problem, but I'm glad you're here now. You also take a very global sweep in your work. And I wonder if you have come across any case studies or any policies that you've found have really valued care work and have found a way to really formalize that as part of the economy.
So thank you so much for inviting UNDP to this conversation. I would never say I'm an expert with having Alessandra and Jen here. I work on development and gender equality, so care economy is at the center, right? Having said that, UNDP with UN Women, we launched a coronavirus COVID global tracker just to measure how governments were responding in terms of addressing the needs of women and gender equality. So we were screening 5,000 measures from more than 220 countries. And we found out, first of all, that definitely the pandemic has been a turning point to create more awareness, common understanding on the importance of the care economy and the care work and care services. And so the crisis put name to those activities that my colleagues were mentioning that are critical for life. And also the pandemic kind of helped to give more value to this work. And I will give you some evidences, but also another benefit that we see from the global tracker, some evidences that how men were increasing, doing more and sharing this work during the pandemic, but also how the patterns, the gender division of labor is very hard to shift. So which are the most common measures that we have been seen from countries implementing? First of all, family leave for working parents is at the top, to care children and the sick members of the family. Second, cash programs, cash for care, programs to compensate parents for school absence, daycare closures. And third, the promotion of flexi-work arrangements. There are some good examples coming from, for instance, from Argentina. They approved a regulation for domestic workers so that they get granted paid leave and salary increase. From Cook Island, for instance, cash for care schemes. The government created these cash for care schemes that have been implemented to ensure parents can take care of their children during school closure. Chile, very interesting initiative. Develop an universal emergency family income, covering more than 3 billion. They spent 3 billion and reaching almost 7 million people, prioritizing women, pregnant women, mothers, and women in vulnerability. There is a long list of here and there, but I'm going to share with you the numbers that are really shocking. So those are good examples, but the data shows that the global response is not really addressing women's needs. The tracker proved that only 7% of all the social protection and labor market government measures target care work, care services. So this means that is 226 out of the total 3,099. So even though we see more and more countries kind of engaging in this kind of social protection work and measures, there are many, many other countries that they do not have even the social safety nets. And as Alessandra said, women in communities are the ones leading the work on creating these safeties in communities. So in my view, the aspiration is definitely not to just expand care services, is to create an economy that cares for all, right? For communities, individuals, for the planet, that now we come from Glasgow. So let's open this for the debate here.
You know, it's so crazy you mentioned that 7% of the policies targeted care work, because it became clear that care work was the backbone of the economy. And, if you want an economic recovery, then you fix that backbone. I think some part of it has to do with the idea that care work is seen as women's issues. And, that's different from the broader economy. There isn't still that connection between these two things. But you brought up the universal basic income. And I want to get into that because there has been this idea that if you give cash for care or universal basic income, then you would reinforce those gender stereotypes, right? Like women would then be incentivized to stay at home. So how have you seen that play out? And then I want to go to Alessandra and Jen about this question too.
So we in UNDP really believe that we need to promote across governments temporary basic income and universal basic income. So let's talk about the temporary basic income. I'm going to share with you one sentence from our Bureau Director of Asian Pacific, but it's not really from her, but I was reading a blog from her and she was writing Rule number 1 of crisis management: when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. So the first kind of reaction and measure is to stop digging in the poverty hole, in the deprivation that women face, deprivation of time, deprivation of a long list. So at the beginning, UNDP, we published a report encouraging governments to adopt temporary basic income measures, programs, and in particular, we also launched a briefing and we made calculations on temporary basic income only for women, focusing on women, because they are 24%, right? More likely than men to lose their jobs during coronavirus. So we really believe that temporary basic income ensures financial security in the short term, is a response to a crisis, but also paves the way somehow for universal basic income. So universal basic income it should not only target the care work. It needs to be, the concept of universal is expanding the concept of targeting women so we reinforce the stereotypes. So you are very agreed. This is a serious concern. But we see how countries are moving towards this TBI, temporary basic incomes. I wanted to share with you that South Africa, Bangladesh, India, Egypt, Spain, Burkina Faso, Kenya. So what is for me the solution somehow is that you need to accompany, regardless if it's temporary or universal, with different measures that, for instance, to work on social norms, right? Because social norms are the roots that are sustaining the segregation system, the division between the productive world and the reproductive. So you cannot implement one measure in a kind of a standalone context. You need to complement this with other measures. But we are very, very favorable to universal basic income because we think it will provide social stability, will reduce poverty, and it will help women to leave the house. So somehow it's not that because women receive a basic income, this is just, I will stay at home. It is if the government only develop programs on basic income for care work, and that's not what universal income is. So I think I will stop here. I have by far more to talk about the universal basic income. I am passionate with this, but let's discuss more with colleagues.
Alessandra, do you have thoughts to add to that?
Yes, I will echo a lot of the arguments that are put forward by Raquel, actually. Of course, I'll be in favor of, well, as a temporary measure, I think it's a no-brainer during a crisis like this one, but also on a longer-term framework. Actually, if you look at the first people that put forward the idea of what it was a prototype of universal basic income, that would be feminist group in the 1970s under the slogan, well, by then considered very radical, but it was somehow pioneering wages for housework, which led me to a second point. I echo Raquel's point on social norms, but I think for me the important way forward policy-wise would be to push for basic income while at the same time finding ways to value care. And I don't see this as the same thing, because I think the type of work that communities involved in unpaid care do has to be valued and paid for. Also beyond discussions on basic income. And finally, I think while it's very important to talk about monetized ways for women and carers to access livelihoods, I think it's important that we have these discussions also as policy moves towards the decommodification of public services, particularly in health and education, because we do know that these have a tremendous redistributive effect. And every time that we cut the welfare state, is women that have to sort of step up and do the work. So putting back money into the welfare state, it's very important, and we'll do the opposite.
Jen, let's come back to the U.S. And I feel like if everyone from around the world is joining, I need to contextualize the U.S. system just to lay the facts out. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have a paid parental leave system. Childcare is extremely expensive for many families. It's unaffordable here. And that was a lot of the things, that was the part of the collapse of the female labor force participation was driven by the fact that there is no sort of safety net here in the US, or there isn't a robust safety net here in the US. Jen, for the first time, maybe ever, the US started giving out something that's very similar to a universal basic income in terms of the child tax credit. Families started receiving monthly checks. So I don't know if you've been having conversations, but have you seen a cultural shift or a social shift for people who have been receiving that?
So I think what's been happening in the pandemic is a significant culture shift on caregiving in general. What we had before was this notion that care is a personal responsibility to be managed by women in the privacy of our homes. And if for some reason you couldn't figure it out, you couldn't afford it, you couldn't manage it, it was seen as a personal failure, that you didn't have the right job, you failed to save, you're a bad daughter or a bad parent.
Yeah.
And I think what the pandemic did was create a massive opening for people to understand that we need to be investing in care as if it's public infrastructure, that we need public supports and investments in caregiving in order for us to be able to participate and for the rest of the economy to function. So the idea that we're starting to talk about care as infrastructure, and that includes paid family and medical leave, child care, elder care, especially in the home and community, and the child tax credit, all of that is a part of the public good that we should be investing in the way that we invest in bridges, tunnels, broadband. That's where the conversation is at the policy level now. At the cultural level, we still have a lot of work to do to really cement this idea of care as a common good. And I think that is where we are, is that there's this opening. We need to really establish a new policy framework and then also continue to move the shifts in our culture to help people understand that this is a collective responsibility, right? And this is the role of government. The definition of the role of government is to help people in societies do the things that they cannot do alone. Right. And that is care in a nutshell. And the other big breakthrough we have in the United States is seeing the care workforce as an essential workforce. Forever, this work has been undervalued, underpaid. It's been poverty wage work where the professionals that we rely upon to take care of us can't take care of themselves or their own families doing this work as a profession. Right now, we have a really unique opening to shift that, and that is what so many of us have been working on in the context of the Build Back Better agenda in the United States. It's the first time we are ever proposing adequate public investments in our caregiving programs to support working families, especially working women.
Right. Alessandra, you've also been looking at the definition of essential care and what that looks like around the world. As Jen said, it's always been sort of really undervalued here in the US. How is it different elsewhere?
Well, essential work has become the mantra during the pandemic, and I think it has some potential benefit, but also we have to see where we at from studying the list of essential work occupations from around the world. So I think, there's a general understanding that some occupation belong to essential work like healthcare, but you also have that different countries listed as essential different types of work based on the economic system. So to give you an example, we might think about schools and paid care in Europe or Agen was actually referring to how the US debate is going, but actually in Brazil, mining was considered essential work, was listed as essential work. In India, steel making was listed as essential work, while instead schooling was excluded and care was excluded. Paid domestic work was only considered essential, not in the UK, but it was in Italy, of course, because in Italy, without elder care, the system itself would not work. And in South Africa, live-in paid work was considered essential. So there was a lot of variation. And my concern is, so far, there has been sort of only partial overlaps between debates on essential work and unpaid care, while instead I think unpaid care was really performing a key function within the crisis. And so how we can continue debates on what is essential work in ways that place unpaid care at the center is a question that different governments will have to address based on what has been their experience of what they have represented as essential during the pandemic.
Raquel, when you were tracking the global gender response, how much of global governments were considering care work as essential work?
We didn't track exactly this in what is the number, the taxonomy.
Yeah.
But I can give you an answer more linked to GBV, gender-based violence. We definitely were tracking that because there are more sophisticated kind of systems to track GBV, gender-based violence, violence against women. So very, very few countries understand even the services to protect, to respond, to address, to GBV as essential work. But this can be a very interesting research. My guess is that Alessandra is going on this direction, and we will be very interested. It's very important to have some standardization in the definition of essential work.
Yeah.
As well as on the care work, right? Both.
Yeah. So, as we look forward to the future and, governments are trying to figure out next steps, what are some of the policy suggestions you have? And then I want to go around to Alessandra and Aijen as well. What's on your wish list for governments to adopt? UBI.
So, if I go for the big one definitely goes through first counting unpaid care in the national accounting system. So we have full clarity and connection between the formal and informal kind of economy, because the care work is part of the informal economy, but it's not even counted in the informal economy. So it can be something fantastic for also to revisit. The second idea can be revisit, how do we measure GDP growth? So we can also put inside the counting properly, right? The care, the service, the care economy. So another one, of course, if we are going to address the care work, is review the taxation system. Otherwise, there is no way for countries to deliver or develop any infrastructure, any kind of response to the gaps that we see. And it's a good sign now that the G20, for instance, right, were pushing for a minimum taxation for big entrepreneurs, big companies. So this is not just a national conversation, it's a global conversation on the review of the taxes and the taxation system in order to have a kind of fair conditions, right? Also, we think that the state should be the main provider. So the state should be the main provider, care provider. So the more concrete expansion of care services is fundamental, but linked to the increase of women's activity rate. And this is where we see the tension and the potential kind of tension reinforcing stereotypes. So some ways that government can start implementing, and there are good examples in many countries, but paid maternity, paternity leave, breastfeeding spaces, flexible working arrangements, address the pay gap. So it's not the woman, the one who stays at home. active labor measures to reskill these women that have been doing the caregiver work to enter in the labor market. And finally, again, I wanted to insist in the gender norms work, because this is part of the roots of the kind of unfair distribution of work across the board. So in UNDP, we are giving a lot of emphasis to that. In fact, last year, we just established 116 partnerships with institutions to address this core component. And definitely place power at the center of the conversation, right? Because finally, it's about the division about public and private. So I like a lot what Alessandra said. Put in value care work means put in value the private sphere of our lives, right?
Yeah.
Individual, it doesn't need to be family. In fact, we need to kind of open the discussion also for the meaning of care for individuals, not just families. So there are many things but it cannot be one standalone initiative. It needs to be systematic and kind of strategic at the same time. Thank you.
Ai-jen, what's on your wish list?
First and foremost, that we pass the Build Back Better Act, and the House is scheduled to vote on it the week of November 15th, and then it goes to the Senate. So we could have we will have a historic investment in our care infrastructure, the biggest in history, since many of these programs were established by Thanksgiving. So that needs to happen first. And what that does is it stabilizes, secures, and allows us to modernize existing programs for childcare and home and community-based care for individuals with disabilities and older people, and supporting the family caregivers who rely upon those services. And it would establish a new paid family and medical leave program in our country, which doesn't exist, as you mentioned, and we are so far behind. I think only one of 2 countries in the world. So that would be a huge generational step forward. And I think where we need to go long term is universal access to programs that support our caregiving needs across the lifespan and across our abilities. So a program that we've been conceptualizing is called Universal Family Care. The idea that we should all contribute to and benefit from a program that allows us to take care of the people that we love across the lifespan: childcare, family medical leave, elder care, support for people with disabilities and individuals. So that's the I think long-term vision. And I think what we can do with Build Back Better is make a great leap forward in that direction.
Alessandra, what's your wish list?
Well, I think a lot has been already covered by Raquel and Ai-jen, and I'm just so envious a little bit by Ai-jen's optimism on the government. I'm sitting on the UK as an Italian working on India, so the governments that I'm dealing with at the moment, none of them really seem to be like particularly exciting when it comes to these issues. But I have to say, more in general, I would say that I very much hope. I have very much hope in debates around care income, as I said, as part of a debate on basic income, but also as autonomous. And I know it's been debated among feminists as well, because the idea, or like the fear, is at least the question: are we getting women back into the home if we actually sort of make this unpaid contribution paid for? But actually, historically, the gender disadvantage has been built on the extraction of this care work as unpaid. So by valuing it and providing an income for carers instead, we might be redressing already women's disadvantage into the paid sphere.
So I have questions from the audience, and I'm going to combine 2 questions, and I'm going to ask them to all of you. What is the role of journalists in changing these gender cultural norms that we've all three of us have said that sort of at the root of the problem is this sort of the stereotypes. And what role does something like Hollywood have in that, right? So Raquel, I'll start with you, and Ai-jen, I know you've done a lot of interesting campaign work on that, so we'll come to you next. Raquel.
Thank you. So I think the role of journalists is fundamental by all means and in all fronts, because finally they are the ones who take picture of the reality and disseminate this picture across the world. So give visibility to women, value the work of women, value the care work. How do they use the language is fundamental. Which kind of news they select is also fundamental. So I was very, very impressed by the new language about heroism, right? We have new heroes. That's the right thing to do, to flag who are the new heroes. And also, that's an example, and also handle numbers, statistics. Go to the statistics to always, I know this is a good practice for the journalism. I don't want to by any means to lecture anyone here, but the numbers and data are very, very useful to deconstruct the stereotypes and bias. So I recommend two things. One, work. We all have our gender bias. Work in your own gender bias. How do you see these issues, right? And second, go to the statistics. And third, embrace a new language that brings more kind of fairness into the picture related to women and the link to the unpaid care work. So do not reproduce the stereotypes, including in photos. Visual language is fundamental. So push back always on the kind of women's cleaning or whatever. The role of Hollywood, you said, is this the question?
Yeah.
So I think it's fundamental, right? To use champions. So they are influencers, no? They represent things for people. So imagine that we have, I don't know, it's very from the north. So we wanted to mix the Hollywood from the south also, right? The Bollywood and in India is not. There are many examples of champions that we can use. We, our organization, for instance, we use soccer, very famous soccer people. So it's very useful because you don't reach many times the young audience or the new generations that will be in charge of reproducing or reinventing a different world. So I think it's very important, the role of them. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Ai-jen, tell me about the campaigns that you've been working on that, really tackle these cultural norms.
So I would say that from a journalist standpoint, part of the role is to figure out what are the core narratives inside of the dominant culture that need to shift in order to open up new possibilities for policy and culture change. And the three narratives that I think are most important to shift are, one, the idea that care is a personal responsibility and a personal burden, and if you can't figure it out, a personal failure. So care from a personal individual burden to a collective shared responsibility in need of public solutions and investment. The second is around care from invisible to visible and valued in our society. And part of that is making the identity of the caregiver visible and human. And there is not one caregiver. Caregivers are young and old. They have disabilities and they are fully able. They are of all races and all classes. And we have to be able to tell a very holistic picture of who caregivers are so people can identify and say, that's me. And I am a hero. And that's the third narrative shift, which I think is really important and goes to the role of Hollywood, is actually having caregivers portrayed as protagonists, not as victims, right? People who are powering the economy, powering their families, powering our community. And in that context, some of the most beautiful storytelling that can happen to really create that shift happens in our popular culture, on television, in film. There's a great new show on Netflix called Maid, which is about this single mom who gets a job as a housekeeper to survive. And it's about the impossible set of choices that she has to make as a domestic worker in order to pay the bill, like the choice between food and gas, right? It's the and nothing could be more powerful in shifting our emotional relationship to these issues than that kind of storytelling. So that's the reason why we do really believe in partnerships and engaging with storytellers, less as influencers, although I think that's very important, but more so that we can start flooding our narrative environment with the realities of caregiving and caregivers, and doing it in a way that shows that this is actually a systemic issue. This is not because one woman was a victim of abuse, right? That this is because we have systematically failed to invest in our caregiving economy.
Right. I think there's another movie coming out soon with Joaquin Phoenix, where he is the caregiver, and I think that's it's very rare to see male protagonists as caregivers. That's also a huge sort of shift in perception. I hope the audience takes that away. So with that, I think I'm going to wrap this. I think this is a nice place to end. Thank you, all of you, for joining me and for your time and for sharing your insights with us. I hope the audience took away lots of tips and information. Anissa, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Alisha. Thank you, Aijen, Alessandra, and Raquel. I'm definitely going to try and look at Maid when I go back home. Aijen, thank you for the reminder. At Spark News, we truly believe in the importance of changing the narratives. And we also believe that journalists has an important role to play in it. So to wrap up on this incredible webinar, we'll be sending you a recap newsletter with the recording of the webinar and also more information in depth to go look at other sources. There's not just movies or TV shows, you also have podcasts and incredible other artists working on those topics to change the way we talk about it in a meaningful way. So thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have another session in a few weeks on the gender data gap, another very important topic to tackle. So we'll of course keep you posted. Thank you all for joining this session. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.